In particular, I am actually going to speak on Ghana's public debt and how the 2022 budget addresses it. Um, in the past, is it 2 weeks, couple of weeks, or in the last week, there's been a lot of stories on the Ghanaian news media trying to address the public debt issue. Um, I agree with most people. I agree with most people who think that debt sustainability is the biggest challenge to the Ghanaian economy. So in my presentation today, I would try to discuss the concept of debt sustainability in three parts. First, I will discuss how the budget 2022 plans to achieve debt sustainability by the mid-year target of 2025. Okay, so we are trying to discuss the Ghanaian economic outlook, right? So I'll go a little bit beyond 2022 and then discuss the mid-year target, which the Ministry of Finance have set for themselves, which is 2025. I would also talk about how realistic the government's plan to achieve debt sustainability is. And then lastly, there is no way you can talk about budget 2022 without discussing the e-levy. So I'll put in context how in the plan of the government, the e-levy hopes to achieve that targeted debt sustainability. Okay. In my presentation today, I'll be presenting to you some numerical exercise I did. I did some simulation based on the data using the budget 2022, and I will present the results. Just to set the ball rolling, I want to declare my sources of data because I know now sources of data is a big issue in Ghana. First, for every historical data I used in my simulation, it came from the IMF. So in particular, my historical debt to GDP ratio is not what the Ministry of Finance is quoting, which I have seen, but I used the historical debt to GDP ratio as provided by the IMF. Okay. In my projection or in my numerical exercise, the historical debt to GDP ratio doesn't actually matter. So the historical data just puts us in context. The most critical data which I used in my simulation mainly comes from the Ministry of Finance. Okay, so in terms of my current and projected data, I took every information from the budget 2022 and also previous budgets. Okay. I have a state-of-the-art debt projection model which I use in my simulation. That model was originally built by some staff in the IMF. And this model is simply known as DDT, and it's a worldwide used model used in projecting debts for a lot of countries. All right, most countries use this model. So it's not a model which I built from scratch. It's a model which I tweaked to fit the purposes of what I wanted to talk about in relation to the Ghanaian economy. So the best you can talk about is projections. In the news published by Bloomberg last week, they were quoting the end of year debt to GDP ratio to be around 81.3%. We can clearly see, and here I have to say I'm using the IMF historical data. We had a peak in debt to GDP ratio in 2001. That was before we joined HIPIC, and then through the HIPIC initiative, and subsequently we were able to bring down our debt to GDP ratio to a lower point, a little less than 20%. And then since 2005, we've seen an increase in debt to GDP ratio, rising to what I expect it to be 80.4%. Now, this is where the government's plan comes in. If the Ministry of Finance is able to achieve all the target they've set for themselves, which are these 5 points, I expect that the debt to GDP ratio would decrease to 79.1% in 2022, end of year 2022, and then by 2025, we would have a debt to GDP ratio less than 70%, which is 69.1%. This is what I'm calling the best case scenario for Ghana. Okay. If this gives confidence. I'm not able to tell depending on where you're looking at this data, but this is the best Ghana can realize. If the government is able to achieve all their targets set or laid out in budget 2022, we would see a decline in debt to GDP ratio from 2022. 2022 would see about 79.1%, and then by 2025 we would have a debt to GDP ratio of 69.1%. Okay, so this is what I think is the best case scenario for Ghana. Is this too high? Personally, if this is achieved, if the government can achieve this, I would really be impressed. And I think almost every investor around the world, if this is going to be realized by the Ghanaian economy, would be impressed. Okay? But what is the plan to achieve this? Now, I have told you what the government has set for themselves, the target. How are they going to execute this plan? Okay, generally, when you are thinking about dealing with public debt, there are four main ways to deal with public debt. The first way to deal with public debt is to announce a default on the debt. I have this in red because I don't think the government is going to do that. Announcing a default means that tomorrow we wake up and then the Minister of Finance tells Ghanaians they are not going to pay the debts they owe. They won't pay. All right, I don't think the Minister of Finance is ever going to think of this. Dr. Maud Maumia is highly rated to embark on this course. The second way to deal with public debt is to monetize the debt by issuing currency. So from Ghana's point of view, the Bank of Ghana can actually monetize the debt by printing money to pay for the debt. For obvious reasons, we live in an inflation and in a high inflation country. So I don't think this is a path which is recommended for the Ghanaian economy, and I don't think the government is going to embark on this path. The third way to deal with debt is actually to issue more debt to pay for the existing principal and interest. Now, this is what we have done in the past, and we have been successful in doing it in the past. We have borrowed from the market, we've borrowed from both domestic and foreign markets, and we've been able to use that to service our previous debt. Now, if this is possible, the government would continue to do this. But the only challenge with this, with the third method, is that currently we are facing a little bit of a challenge in borrowing, especially in the Eurobond. Okay, so the previous avenue of borrowing from all sectors to finance our previous debt is not available to us now as a country. But the government still has an option. The government can still borrow on the domestic market. And then the government is very lucky because I realize that Ghanaians have big appetite for government debts. All right, most banks in Ghana would prefer to buy government bonds, government treasuries, than to lend to private investors. So the government has that option there. The government can still borrow on the domestic market, just that on the global market or in the global Eurobond market, they might be a little bit restrained. So that's why I have that in purple. The government has that option to still borrow from the domestic market, but not on the foreign market. Another option the government have, still on point 3, is that they can go to the IMF, all right, to get a concessionary loan. So that option is also available to the government. Now, the third point, which I think the government is going to use, and not I think, the government has said they are using from the budget 2022, is to improve the fiscal balance. To improve fiscal balance, there are two ways to improve fiscal balance. You either increase revenue or you decrease expenditure. I have increasing revenue in blue because that is the goal the government is setting for themselves. They want to increase revenue. And I have decreased expenditure in red because the budget did not address this issue, even though I think it is critical for the government to decrease expenditure. The government thinks Ghana has a revenue problem. I agree that Ghana has a revenue problem, but Ghana has a bigger expenditure problem, which the government is not addressing. And in the next slide, I show you why I think so. This is the growth in total revenue, historical growth in total revenue in Ghana. The 2022 budget expects that our total revenue will grow above 40%, around 42.9%. Okay, so the government is expecting a huge increase in total revenue. The last time I checked, the last time we had a growth in total revenue beyond 40% was in 2011. Now, 2011, you may recall, was when we had discovered oil in commercial quantities and oil revenue were coming in. Okay, so I think the government is expecting an oil discovery change in revenue in 2022 to boost its efforts to deal with the public debt, the looming public debt crisis we are experiencing. Okay, so the government is doing all it can to boost revenue. All right, but if we look at the expenditure side, instead of seeing a decrease in expenditure, we are still increasing our expenditure. In that case, we are not dealing with the expenditure problem we are having. We are just trying to hope we can accumulate too much revenue to dwarf the expenditure problem we have.
2022 economic outlook, Ghana. It's Setekbe, Dewey Champon, and then Nsafoah.
Getting some feedback. Okay, so that is the plan the government has. The government wants to deal with our debt problem, but they want to accumulate more revenue to dwarf the expenditure problem we have, and they are not directly dealing with the expenditure problem we have. Okay. So how realistic is this plan? Okay. The plan, which is realizing oil discovery-like change in revenue, I think is a very bold, very ambitious plan, and then I dare to say it is quite unrealistic. Okay. In my simulation, I realized that in the worst case scenario, I'm calling this the worst case scenario because I don't expect us to get there. If our key macro variables behave on average as they have done in the past 10 years, our debt to GDP ratio would hit about 95% by 2025. Okay, that's what I think is the worst case scenario. We behave as we have done in the past without making any change, and then we can go on the bad path and realize a debt to GDP ratio of about 95%. I don't think we would get there, but what do I think is the most likely case for the Ghanaian economy? I think the government will do the best they can. They will try to increase their revenue. They would manage their expenditure in the best possible way they can. But there are exogenous factors Ghana cannot deal with. And that, I think, is the most realistic case. Ghana will be hit with an exogenous interest rates and exchange rate shock. Okay. The era for cheap money, almost every economy in the world would agree, is over. Tomorrow, the U.S. Federal Reserve, the FOMC of the U.S., is meeting, and then most likely outcome is that they are going to lay a path to increase interest rates this year. So the US is on course to contracting monetary policy, and then a contraction of monetary policy from the US implies that global interest rates are going to go up. So definitely Ghana has no influence on the decision of the FOMC in the US. They are going to do what they want to do because inflation in the US is 7%, which is the highest they have seen in the last 30 years. So monetary policy in the US definitely has to deal with inflation in the US. So the FOMC of the US is going to increase interest rates sometime in this year. An increase in the US interest rate would definitely have a negative impact on the Ghanaian economy, and that would also have a negative impact on our exchange rate. So this, I think, would be the most likely case. We'll be hit with exchange rates and interest rate shocks. And from my simulation, if we are hit with that exchange rates and interest rate shock, the best outcome that we would see is that by the end of the year, 2022, our debt to GDP ratio would actually increase to 83.9%, which is not very good, but I think is the most likely outcome. By 2025, as inflation in the US goes down and then the Fed decrease the pace at which they contract money, things would improve, and then we would have a debt to GDP ratio of about 73.6% by 2025. These are numerical exercise and simulations from the data I gathered. This begs the question, will the government of Ghana likely request for an IMF intervention? I personally think they will. I think they don't have an option. They may delay it, but eventually they would go for it. When I was thinking about this situation, the most likely outcome that played in my mind was maybe at the end of the year, when they realize they can't achieve the revenue target they have set for themselves because it's too high, that is when they will start talking to the IMF. But over the weekend, I had the opportunity of interacting with Honorable Setekwe, and then he made a point that he thinks that it would even be shorter. I don't doubt that. I think it is the most prudent thing for them to do is to actually start talking to the IMF, because the target they have set for themselves is quite unrealistic, and then they can't achieve that 42% increase in revenue. Like I said, you can't talk about budget 2022 without discussing the e-levy. So how does the e-levy influence, or how does the e-levy impact the government's plan to achieve sustainability in Ghana? From the budget 2022, the government expects to accumulate about 33.8 billion cedis from the e-levy between 2022 and 2025. So there have been a number of proposals in dealing with the e-levy. The minority in parliament wants it totally scrapped, and you can understand why the minority would want the e-levy to be totally scrapped. I've heard some economists, I think the known economist I heard was Dr. William Babwati, who taught me in Legon, actually suggests an e-levy of 1%. I also consider a compromise of an e-levy of 1.5%. So I take all these proposals and I simulate them, and then I assess the impact of the e-levy on Ghana's debt to GDP ratio, and then I show the results in the next slide. Okay. So the red line here is the target I think the government wants, or the most likely outcome the government can achieve, which is the ECOWAS rationalized convergence criteria. So that is 70% debt to GDP ratio. The black line you see is the best case scenario, which I presented earlier. That is the case where the government is able to achieve all the asset objectives, including having a 1.5% e-levy proposal, right? I showed you that if the government can do that, then we would have a debt to GDP ratio of less than 70% by 2025. Okay. I simulate different proposals. First, I consider a case where there is no e-levy, and then there is no structural change to the budget. Okay. So the minority have their way, the e-levy is not passed, and then the government doesn't tweak or change their budget significantly in terms of the expenditure side. This is the path of debt to GDP ratio by the end of 2025. We'll still be hovering around 80% debt to GDP ratio if the e-levy is not passed. And this is not a good outcome for the Ghanaian economy. I also consider the 1% e-levy proposal, and I show that in the yellow line here. If the e-levy is passed, but we have just a 1% proposal, we would see a decrease in the debt to GDP ratio, but it won't be as what the government would want, which is to hit their target. So even by 2025, we will still be way above the 70% debt to GDP ratio, right? And then my compromise, which is 1.5% of GDP, it's not enough to achieve the 70%. A debt to GDP ratio less than 70%, but it gets it close. Okay, I don't know if the Ministry of Finance will be happy with the 1.5, which gets it close but doesn't achieve it. But if they want to achieve the target, then it is difficult for them to get even close to the target without realizing a 1.75% in the e-levy proposal. Let me point this out. This in no way suggests that I think the e-levy is a good proposal in increasing government revenue. I have my own personal concerns, but for my numerical exercise and simulations, I had to use what was being proposed. Are my main takeaways from my presentation today. The first point I want you to understand is that Ghana is actually facing a looming debt crisis. We have an issue with debt, which has to be dealt with, irrespective of what anybody says. All right, a debt to GDP ratio of 80% or around 80% for the Ghanaian economy is not a good thing. No investor sees this and is very comfortable about it. The government acknowledges it. I think in the last monetary policy report from the Bank of Ghana, they actually pointed out that we have issue with debt in Ghana, and as a result, they've seen evidence of capital flight from Ghana. The government knows this, and then I know they know this because the budget was purposely written to address this debt crisis. we have seen what the government's plan to deal with this debt crisis is. The Minister of Finance always points out their targets, and we know how they want to achieve this target by experiencing realizing an oil discovery like change in total revenue. But from my personal experience or from my personal opinion, I think the plan the government has is a little bit unrealistic. It is overly ambitious and they may fall short there. So what do I propose? In the short term, I think the government should call the IMF if they haven't started negotiating with the IMF for some sort of intervention. In the medium term, the government also has to deal with the expenditure problem that we have. They have shown great commitment in dealing with the revenue side of the budget, trying to increase total revenue. But I think Ghana has a bigger expenditure problem than we have in terms of revenue. So if the government can show commitment in dealing with the expenditure side of the budget, that would also be great. I stand to be corrected, but I think I read from the media, the Auditor General reported close to 12.1 billion Ghana cedi as a result, loss in revenue of about 12.1 billion cedis as a result of corruption, right? These are sort of inefficiencies in our economy, and if the government can show strong commitment in dealing with the inefficiencies on the expenditure side of the problem, that would be great. Okay, so this is what I think is a Ghanaian economic outlook for 2022 and beyond. Thank you very much for giving me your audience. Done.